Welcome, everybody, once again to the briefing room. And today we are talking about one of the most evil men in World War II, Dr. Death himself, Josef Mengele. And to talk about him is my very special guest, author and historian, Gerald Posner. Welcome, Gerald, to the briefing room.
Great, great to be with you, John. A pleasure to join you.
And we're going to be talking about your book on the man himself, Josef Mengele. I found this um, very interesting, but sickening in parts.
Yeah, I mean, if when people hear the name Josef Mengele, or they know that he's a Nazi doctor who had been at the largest Nazi extermination camp,
Mm.
they've heard his nickname, the Angel of Death. They often think just of Auschwitz, the place where he did earned his infamy, where he did his experiments on children. But as you know from the book,
Yeah.
the only one chapter is about that. So when you say that it at times, and I've heard people say to me, the book gets my blood boiling or it's so upsetting. It's not
Mm.
just upsetting about the crimes, those are horrendous. We cover that in that chapter. But
Yeah.
how he gets away, how he stays free, how this man that we think of as one of the most wanted war criminals after World War II is able to stay one step ahead of his hunters, not by being the cleverest man in the world, but sort of by incompetence at times,
Mm.
failure to aggressively look for him. This is somebody who could have been caught, should have been caught a number of times. So it is a story that, in the end, is an indictment of the failure of governments like Germany and others to really go after him.
Yeah, that's what I liked about your book, that you sort of took the blinkers off what we know about Mengele, and we only know a tiny, tiny bit, which is the most horrific bit. But what? How did you come to write about Mengele?
So, sometimes what I love about life is it takes unexpected turns. And this is one of those instances. If you had asked me in the late 1970s, I started to practice law as a lawyer when I was in 1978. If you had asked me then if I'd ever be writing about Josef Mengele, I would have said, "What? No, I can't imagine that." And then in the early 80s, I was approached by a twin. His sister was also alive. They had been experiment victims of Mengele. They had been sent to me through a friend who worked in the American Department of Justice. And they said, "Hey, we're surviving twins. There are a handful of us left of the thousands that he had in the concentration camp. And we spend thousands of dollars a year on medical costs in the United States just trying to deaden the pain of what he did to us years ago. We get some restitution from the German government, but everybody gets the same amount of money, whether you were in the camp for one day at the end of the war, or you were there for 2 years, whether you were experimented on, had limbs cut off, or whether or not. So we'd like the German government or the Mengele family just to pay for our medical costs, to go ahead and cover the cost of what we have from that doctor." And I said, as a lawyer, I'll dedicate my time, no charge. It was what we call a pro bono lawsuit, and I'll represent you. And I thought, this is a simple thing to do. I should never underestimate what a task is. So it actually went on for the better part of 4 years, that volunteer project. We got thrown out of court because an American court said to us, "Wait, you're trying to sue on behalf of American citizens today who were born in another country, who were experimented on in occupied Poland by a German army officer at the end of World War II, and asking an American court to get a German government to pay more money? No chance." So they tossed it out of court.
Wow.
But I had a lot of research by then, when you're
Yeah.
focused on one subject. And so that research, I then thought, that could become a book. And together with a British journalist, I eventually ended up putting that in a book. We donated part of the proceeds back to the twins to help them recover some of that funding, and it became a sort of a project passion.
Mhm.
And in that time that I was putting that book together, Josef Mengele's bones were found. We can talk about that in South America. And so in the end, I'm able to do here a very comprehensive book that tells you not only about what he did in the war, not only how he got away, John, but
Mhm.
also what he was thinking after the war by
Mhm.
getting into his private letters and diaries.
Wow. That's a one hell of a project.
Yeah, it is, but it's a project that if I wish that I could say to you I had planned it out. That's how
Yeah.
I knew it would take place, but that wasn't the case at all. And so, just one part of how this worked and might be of interest to your listeners as well. It
Mm-hmm.
goes to show you what I call the serendipity when you're a researcher or an investigator of how things can work out. So I had, when I, sometimes you get things that are new and important about a part of history, not because you're cleverer than anybody else who's looking at it, but because your timing turns out to be right.
Yeah.
And sometimes that can be accidental. So I arrived in Argentina for my first round of research on Josef Mengele in November of '84.
Mm-hmm.
And there had been rumors for years that Mengele had been in Argentina after the war, but nobody could prove it. We didn't have the documents. And so I went to the presidential palace called Casa Rosada, and I asked to see the Mengele file. Now, I didn't know at that time. If I had known that the German government, the Israeli government, Nazi hunters had all asked to see the file and they'd all been told no, maybe I wouldn't have had the the inclination to go ahead and ask for it myself. But my request ended up coming in at a time when the British government had just finished fighting a war not long before over the Falkland Islands. And the British won that war. The Argentine military junta who had controlled the country under a dictatorship was thrown out of power. And Argentina had its first civilian government in a long time. So
Mm-hmm.
my request to see the Mengele file came to that civilian government, which was in a spasm of democracy. And one night, while I was sitting in this little hotel in downtown Buenos Aires, the federal police showed up at my door. They took me down to federal police headquarters, and there was a very grumpy federal police colonel who had been ordered by the civilian government to open up the Mengele file to me. And
Wow.
inside that file was 10 years of his life, how he entered the country under a false name, how he had arrived originally and they thought he had these biology specimens with him, how
Mm-hmm.
he had returned to his real name to use in the middle of the 1950s to fly back to Switzerland to see his family, how he had opened up a pharmaceutical company in the late 50s, how he was even in the telephone book at one point. So that 10-year treasure trove of documents wasn't available beforehand and was only available by the luck of being there at a moment when the government was opening up its files. So that happened time and time again in
Yeah.
this research.
Wow. And before we talk about the man that everybody knows, what was he like as a child? What was his upbringing like?
So he grew up in a very privileged atmosphere, small town, Günzburg, Germany. When I say privileged, his family was the wealthiest family in town. They
Mm-hmm.
owned a farm machinery company. You could see tractors emblazoned with the large metal words Mengele long before it was an infamous name around southern Germany. They employed a lot of people. And he grew up in a wealthy home, but he was also an extremely smart student at school, smart in terms of books and grades. And he went along and decided he would become a doctor. He went to medical school in Germany. And this is key to remember at a time when Nazi ideology about racial theories and superiority, the Nazis had this view that there was a superior race. It was the Aryan race. It was them. It had to be purified and cleansed of all of the ethnic blood that had come in from Russia and the Slavs and from Romanis and Gypsies, and most of all from Jews, who they had viewed as this insidious race. And so the Nazis were teaching that idea of racial superiority at the time that Mengele went to school, and he became enmeshed in it. He was totally won over by the idea of racial superiority. It became the basis of his medical work eventually that he did at the concentration camp.
What drew him towards that ideology? Was it just clicked with him? Was he radicalized?
Yeah, it's a very good point. It's a great point because I think that for some people, there's you take 100 Germans who became sort of avid defenders and proponents of Nazism in the Third Reich, and it varies for every one of them, right? As to how some mesmerized by the charisma of Hitler, hard for us to imagine that, but he had that. Some of them angry over the defeat in World War One, in which they felt as though they had been pushed this terrible treaty and been punished more than anyone else. Were looking to rebuild the country. My wife Tricia, who works with me on projects, wrote about a man who became the chief pharmacist, a Bayer aspirin, a Bayer pharmaceutical company representative in Romania, who became the chief pharmacist at Auschwitz, was not an anti-Semite himself, but became sort of won over by the idea that a greater Germany was being built. For Mengele, it was very much the idea that he thought he was at the edge of a new science. You know, we know about eugenics, the idea that you can engineer a better human being. Unfortunately, it was popular in the late 19th and early 20th century. Even, Margaret Sanger and others who were great activists in their own ways on women's rights sometimes believed that it was possible to sort of cleanse the human species by eliminating elements of it that were otherwise less than good. So the Nazis took that to an extreme. The idea that you're telling a population of people, you really are special. You're genetically special. You're part of a race better than anyone else, and we'll protect that race by making sure that we get rid of all the defective people that otherwise would bring down your Aryan superiority. Is a very, to us it seems reprehensible, but it was very seductive, and it was seductive to the science and medical students like Mengele, who believed that they were at the cutting edge of a new science in which they could help create that master race, in which they could turn brown eyes blue and they could make people look more Aryan and purify the species. It really is science fiction in a sense at its very worst, except it's science fiction that came to reality in this 1930s period and then goes on steroids in reality in the 1940s when the war begins.
Well, how much did his work in anthropology and medicine shape him and ready him for the future?
His work in anthropology, he wrote his doctorate thesis in anthropology about the ability to spot differences in species by merely looking at them. And he was part of a group that would go out together with Nazi, race resettlement groups, and they would have people come before them who would, when they conquered the early areas in Poland, they would say, by the way, I'm Polish Catholic or whatever. People like Mengele would sit there and say, I'm not so sure they're really 4 generations Polish. They seem to me that they have some Slavic blood in them. They must have married a Russian somewhere along the line. Maybe they're Jewish. So he would look for these features in nose, eyes, cheeks, and others in which he thought he could determine what was an inferior race. That's the sort of what I call the judgment part of it. Wow. And he Mengele gets assigned to the Eastern Front where the Nazis have invaded the Soviet Union, and he's wounded there. He gets an Iron Cross, and he is working as a medic on the front line. But after that, his mentor, who was this chief scientist inside the Third Reich called von Verschuur, he was sort of the leading race theologist of the group. He says to Mengele in so many words, I can get you an assignment to someplace else. I can get you an assignment to this enormous concentration camp called Auschwitz in occupied Poland. And there you can do something that no doctor ever gets the access to. You can conduct experiments in the furtherance of the Aryan race and the perfect race on humans. You can essentially, these people are determined, they're destined to die anyway. It's a death camp. And you can have them before they die, and you can do the experiments. And for Mengele, that was a holy grail. That was something, that's why he works on twins, because if you're thinking of this in a cold calculus, the worst possible way, what does a mad scientist want to do if they're experimenting on humans? They want twins because one is the one you do the experiment on, and the other you do nothing on, and they become the control group. And you can see the differences between the two in an exact way, especially if you have identical twins. They're sharing the DNA, the same DNA. So for Mengele, this was the ultimate laboratory. And the part of me that is so remarkable is that you see him descend from the time that he arrives there in 1943. into more barbarism the longer that he's there. The experiments themselves get worse. And after the war, John, the part to me that I continue, no matter how long I've studied this, that still is so disheartening, is you want him after the war, when it's over, as though a magic spell had broken. And then he says, oh my God, what did I do? And starts to think about it and has a bad dream, feels some guilt. He's pulled away from the what I call the radicalization and the propaganda and the immersion of the Third Reich. He sees it in the daylight of a post-war reality, and he says, oh, and I realized what I did was terrible. How can I live with myself? He never has that moment. He never has a moment in which he thinks I did it wrong. And that's remarkable to me, that you can go through it, you can commit the crimes, you can be involved in the worst type of scientific barbarity by a doctor who's supposed to follow the Hippocratic Oath and heal. You're doing just the opposite. And then you never second guess yourself, because you become so delusional in your belief that you can't give up on that.
Well, my question to you then is, if he is, living his dream, so to speak, does he really believe in the Nazi ideology, or does he believe for advancement?
I believe that it's a good question. It's a question that never was asked to him as directly as that. So I wish you had been able to ask him that, and then he would give you the answer. So the best we can do is based upon his writings. His writings are his letters to his family, which I had access to after the war, his autobiography, which he wrote after the war, and these manuals that he would keep. I believe the answer is the first one, that he really believed in the Nazi ideology. He had only one son, born in 1944. He leaves Germany to go to Argentina a few years after the end of the war. His son doesn't have any memory of him. He meets his son once when his son is 16 or 13 in Switzerland for a skiing vacation, but his son doesn't know it's his father. He thinks it's his uncle, the family tells him. So his son doesn't meet him as an adult only once in his life, when the son is 33 and the father is 66. So and at that moment, the son asks him the equivalent of that question in a broader sense, as you would as a family member, questioning Auschwitz. And his father's response to him is why I say he believed so much in the first part of the question you answered, in Nazi ideology. Yeah. He said to his son, don't question me about Auschwitz. Don't even think about it, because you weren't there. You'll never understand it. You'll never know what we were trying to achieve. So, and I think that that's what it was. He had this view that Nazi racial ideology superiority was still correct, that there was some essence of it that was right. And that, to me, one of the good things about that is that he, in his final years, had to live to stay free of his hunters in an area, a poor area of Sao Paulo, that was filled with diversity, that had Brazilians and blacks and Africans and people from the Middle East, and everything that Mengele would hate. Those were his neighbors, and those were the people that helped him stay free, because he sought refuge in that type of diverse area, an area that he would normally have hated to be in, but it was why nobody was looking for him there.
And how, talking about his family, how did his wife fit in his Nazi period?
So, he marries his wife, Irene, she comes from a very good, privileged family as well before the war. And then one of the things that I think might be, some of your listeners might have seen, there are documentaries out, for instance, that show the commandant of Auschwitz, Hess, lived on the grounds of Auschwitz with his family and his children. And they sort of, said, gee, we see smoke over there, and we sometimes smells a little odd, but they were in total denial about what was happening. And they lived this little idyllic life. Well, people like Mengele would have his wife visit the camp. So instead of taking a vacation or holiday by going home, his wife, Irene, would come to the camp. She came there twice, and she wrote in her own letters what it was like. And she described this stench, this odor that seemed so odd to her at one point. And she asked him about it, and he said, he sort of dismissed it cavalierly and said, oh, don't worry about that. It's nothing. Now, I will tell you, Auschwitz was a large camp. There's no question. It had 100,000 people in it at different times, sometimes in the work camp. It was processing enormous numbers, the largest of the four Nazi death camps, into the gas chambers. Trains are arriving in late 43 and in 1944 in the summer when the Hungarian deportations are taking place. They're working overnight. It is impossible to be at Auschwitz, even at the perimeter in where the SS barracks were, and not realize that you were in a place in which there were inmates who were skeletal looking. There was this march toward death. The crematoriums were working all the time and bodies are being burned. It is a factory of death. It's a factory of money, enslaved labor, because they're doing that at Monowitz, which is down the road, which is German industry. They're making money and using slave labor, and it's a machinery of death. When I say a machinery of death, as you know, they aren't just killing Soviets and prisoners and Jews, but they're profiting from it by taking their clothes and goods first. They've told them when they're deporting them to the east, they're sending them out of Budapest or whatever else. By the way, we're sending you to resettlement camps in the east. Now, there were rumors that there were death camps, but no one wanted to believe that. But you're allowed to take up to 50 kilograms of goods with you in your suitcase. So what do you think the families took? They're being resettled to a new area to where they're going to work. They took their most precious goods. They took whatever they had for jewelry. They took their silver candlesticks. They took whatever cash they had. When they got to the camp, the Nazis put them in lines to send them into the gas chambers, took all the suitcases, took all the clothing. They had piles of hair that they ended up reusing. They took the gold out of the teeth of the victims. So, it became a process where they profited from the death as well. How you, as Mengele's wife, which you asked about, go to that camp to have holidays with your husband and leave and not know that is remarkable. And then what does she do, John, after the war? When American investigators show up on her doorstep and say, by the way, we're looking for your husband, he's on a wanted list. They had him in custody twice. They released him. They didn't cross-check the list. She says he's dead. He died in the war. So she covers for him. And meanwhile, she's going to visit him in a little farm in Rosenheim. She helps him get to South America together with the rest of the family. And then she's the one who hides from her own son, Rolf, his real identity until she can't do that any longer when Mengele is finally indicted.
She's just as guilty as him. Just as guilty.
Yeah, I agree. But in some ways, but John, you'll understand this. So for the wife, she can't turn her husband in because she can't bring herself to that realization that she's married to this monster, right? And that she helped him. The amazing part of that equation is the son, Rolf, who never knew his father, knows him only as an adult, learns about his crimes, and then doesn't turn him in, even though his only tie to his father is a biological one. He has no relationship with him. His father treats him terrible in the letters. And then when his father dies in 1979, Rolf, the son, doesn't even tell the world that he's dead. So Nazi hunters and others and the victims of his experiments continue to look for him in vain until the bones are found finally in 85. So you talk about this guilty as Mengele. The family kept him safe. They kept him away from justice, and they hid the truth. And in that sense, they compounded many of these crimes for those who just wanted to get a little bit of justice.
Yeah. Unbelievable. Going back to Auschwitz, when prisoners first met Mengele on the ramp, what was Mengele's role?
You hit one of the reasons why he earned the name the Angel of Death, because Mengele's role is the role of the SS doctors at Auschwitz, which is to go to the ramps when the trains are arriving, packed with people who've been on them for 2, 3, 4 days in these closed cattle cars and they are exhausted by the time they get there. They haven't gotten much sleep. The conditions are disgusting inside. The doors are open when the trains arrive, often arriving at night. There are bright lights. There are guards with German shepherds walking along. You're dazed as you come out of this. And at the head, you're formed 2 lines right away, men into one line, women into another line. And they start to march before these SS officers at the end of the ramp, one of whom is always an SS physician, because the physician is the one, as we talked about earlier with Mengele, who's supposed to be able to spot if someone is unique, different, or whatever else. They would point to the right or the left. You point to the right, you had life. It was sort of like playing God. You point to the left, you end up going into the gas chambers. It was fairly automatic process. And what I mean by that is when the trains arrived, children, for the most part, always sent to death. They didn't want them in the work camp, were too difficult to take care of. Women, for the most part, sent into death. Some of the men taken to be for slave labor for a while. Mengele did something different. He looked for twins. So he didn't do it as an automatic process. His interest was finding experiment victims. So he had at his peak 2,500 sets of twins, almost 5,000 children in his zoo, as he called it, the part that was used for experiments in Auschwitz. And he would look through the group to find the twins to see if they were of any interest. And that was the astonishing part. Most of the SS doctors who did that work did not like it, believe it or not. It's not to say they were better people than Mengele. They just viewed it as one of the least the parts of the job that was the took a toll on you in some ways, seeing the people and sending them to death or not. Mengele volunteered for more time because he wanted to make sure they got his experiment victims. And so I can't tell you how many times you see in the testimony of a survivor, the first impression and the lasting impression they have of arriving at Auschwitz is Mengele. Standing there very neatly dressed. He was very vain. He was a young doctor at 33 years old when he ends up going to Auschwitz. He used to have his Nazi cap somewhat rakishly put to the side, which he thought was more fashionable. He would be sometimes whistling an aria from Tosca. He knew opera very well. He had this polished little baton that he would use. So Mengele was not the person who was forgettable. He was very much the image of the SS doctor playing God, and he did it with relish and gusto.
Well, you'd say about it in whistling. A lot of the survivors mention that he's very calm during the process. He's polite even. How much would that enhance the fear in people?
Oh, you're absolutely right. You hit the nail on the head in that sense. There's no question that it's not to say, look, if you stepped off a train into a place like Auschwitz where you saw the barbed wires and it seemed like you were being rustled into these camps, and the person who was at the head of the line that you had to march to was screaming and raving and drunk, it would still be frightening. But if that person is also very calm and seems to be underplaying the situation, they're in control of it, they're whistling something that's an operatic tune, there's something even more chilling about that, if that it makes sense. And I think that's very much the case with Mengele.
And can you please talk about some of the experiments that he did at Auschwitz?
Yeah, I mean, so the experiments included in, sort of a list of what can you imagine that you could do? He would think of it over time. Injections into the eyes to see if eyes could be changed. There's a inmate doctor. So sometimes one of the things that they would look for at the camp, the SS physicians, would be doctors, arriving physicians. Maybe there would be an inmate physician arriving. They always could use an inmate doctor to help with the worst parts of the experiment. So, you'd come over, you'd become a doctor under Mengele's control, and they would say, do this, clean up this part of the laboratory. One of them, this Dr. Pudzina, at one point describes how she walks into a wall. She almost faints because there are eyes on a board that have been pinned up, literally eyeballs taken out of skulls that are pinned up there for study, just rows of them. And it was the first time she saw them, and she almost started to pass out. So Mengele would do those type of experiments. He'd do spinal injections to see if he could change the growth rate at which children came along. He would do injections and procedures under the scalp to see if he could turn dark hair into blonde hair, or what viewed as more Aryan. And one of the great puzzles about Mengele's experiments is that there was no log kept of them. There was, but he left with it after the war, we believe. There was nothing recovered at Auschwitz of, I did this experiment on this day for this purpose. And that's critical, because one of the mysteries that the twins who I was originally representing in this legal case, they didn't know what had been done to them. They knew that they had been experimented on and things had been done, but as children, you don't quite know what the physician is doing, what the injections are, what he was putting into you. You're not sure what the purpose of it was. So you don't know if the kidney failure that you're experiencing when you're 55 is a result of what he did to you at Auschwitz or is a side effect of some toxic exposure you had at work in the 1960s or 70s. It's hard to differentiate the two. So that's
Yeah.
the mystery of Mengele's experiments. But the one thing I know is this. After the war, the Americans and the British and the Soviets, to their shame, made deals with a number of Nazis to say, hey, by the way, you can work on our rocket science program, right? You were working on those. And they brought Nazis and Germans over to America, for instance. The Soviets were racing against it to build the NASA program for space. They went to some people like Klaus Barbie, who was called the Butcher of Lyon. He was head of the counter Gestapo group. And they said, you give us your information on everything you have on building the intelligence network in this part of France, and we'll send you to South America for free. So people often ask, did they strike a deal with Mengele? Is that how he got away? And the answer to that is no. The Americans and the British did look at Nazi medical experiments to see if there was anything that they could get from them. And the ones that they found useful, believe it or not, were the ones done at other camps by mad doctors, or what I call mad doctors, or absolutely cruel doctors, in which they would take a prisoner, they would have a Jewish prisoner, and they would literally put him into a vat of ice and wait to see how long before he had hypothermia and died. And that was used to tell them how long a German pilot who was shot down in the tundra near Finland or somewhere in the ice fields might be alive before the Germans could get to him and rescue him. And the Americans said, you know what? That's useful information. We should at least be able to have some of that, as terrible as it is. All of that information should be not used at all. But in Mengele's case, it was totally useless because he was trying to prove a fake theory. He was trying to prove that there's a racially superior group of people. And so whatever he did in terms of those experiments was after a false premise and therefore had no value to anyone.
And how much freedom did he have to do whatever experiment he wanted? Had he got total carte blanche to do whatever?
So the reason he had total carte blanche on the experiments to do whatever he wanted is because he had the blessing of Berlin and the authorities in Berlin. So the doctors, for instance, like his mentor, Otto von Verschuur, at the Frankfurt University of Hereditary and Biology, which was sort of the Nazi epicenter of racial ideology, Mengele and others would send skulls back there. They would send body parts and things that they'd used in the experiments they thought might be useful. There was a large collection of it back in Berlin. Berlin viewed this as an incredibly important work. And the key was the average Nazis running the operations for the death machinery and for killing those in the East really didn't understand it. They thought they were part of a superior race, but they didn't know what these scientists and doctors were doing to improve it and enhance it. And so therefore they gave them pretty much carte blanche. What Mengele could not do would be, and this might just simply amaze your listeners, is break the rules that were set down at Auschwitz about other things. And what do I mean by that? You think of Auschwitz as an untamed wild place, but it existed based upon rules. There was a machinery to how the death operated in that. You couldn't go outside of it. So Mengele, at one point on his record in Auschwitz, when he first gets there in his SS records, it later gets a citation that is viewed as a dark mark on his professional record. You know what it was? It was the equivalent of speeding and running a red light or stop sign in Auschwitz on his motorbike. That's true. Now it's hard to believe that there are traffic regulations in a place where they're killing millions of people. You would think that anything goes, but in some ways, by keeping the control over those types of things is the way that they could keep control. So Mengele, for instance, could go into a barracks, as he did time and time again, and do what was called an impromptu selection. Without telling anybody. It was like going into a prison cell and saying, now I'm going to look through this cell and select some people to go to the gas chambers and others not. But he could do that, but he had to tell the others in the camp that was taking place. It had to go through a process. He had to go with other SS personnel. As crazy as it is, there were rules in Auschwitz.
Wow. And the most horrifying part of the book, I think, the one that made me feel very sick, was is not only experimenting, but is also exceedingly cruel. And the part that really made me feel angry, really, as well as sick, is when he's throwing live children onto a bonfire.
So I think that you hit one of the things that's it's astonishing, and you read it and you think to yourself, it's so blood curdling
Mm.
that he's lost every vestige of humanity, and it's what we go back to before when I talk about this decline from early barbarism, still doing the experiments, into what savagery and
Yeah.
unbridled savagery, which is like throwing the infant into the fire. I spoke when I was doing the early Mengele research to this other Auschwitz doctor, Dr. Monk, and he had served with Mengele in Auschwitz. And as he was one of the few doctors, the only doctor who, when he was tried after the war, survivors came forward and said he wasn't a bad guy. He actually never treated us badly. He was okay. He was acquitted of his war crimes. He refused to do the selections we spoke about before at the camp that Mengele relished so much. So they moved him. The SS moved him to a sub-camp at Monowitz, where he eventually viewed blood slides and whatever else. He wasn't really doing anything hands-on like Mengele. But he knew Mengele, and he liked Mengele. So I spoke to him after the war, and he said to me, and I'm going to paraphrase this, so it's a rough thing. He said, Auschwitz was a place where if you had parachuted into Auschwitz on day one, you would have been horrified. Your mouth would drop. You would think, this is unbelievable. It's Dante's Inferno. I can't believe it. On day two, you'd still be horrified, but a little less so. A week later, you wouldn't be as horrified because it started to have a normalcy to it. You'd have the dinners, you'd have instructions, you'd have a break where you'd go to the river. And over time, his point was you become inured to a level of horror that you would think from the outside, I'll never be able to accept that. And he told me, he said, go off and talk to American special forces who served in Vietnam, who cut off the hands of Vietnamese villagers and put at the front of a village on a stick and said, don't work with the enemy. Today they're back in America working for the post office or, for some company, and they probably can't even imagine what they've been involved with. But you get involved in a level of barbarity that becomes a normalcy. I'm not excusing it, but he believed that the worst of the behavior for all of them at Auschwitz came the longer they were there, because the level of what was acceptable that would have on the early parts churned their stomach. You don't see Mengele go in on day one and take an infant and throw them on a fire. You see it toward the end when he's been there for a while, when he has total power, when he is playing God, when he can do anything, when the temper tantrum that you and I might throw over something happening becomes, tossing off a notepad off the desktop because I'm so mad that my computer's crashing. For him, becomes throwing a baby into a fire or something like this. So it's the total loss of any sense of human decency. And that, John, to me, is why I'm so amazed that after the war, there's never a bad dream. There's never a nightmare. There's never a sense of guilt for having done that. Somehow that's blocked out. And he almost blames, in his writings and his discussion with his son, the fact that he says, I didn't invent Auschwitz. I didn't invent it. So that's his excuse. He was put there, and that becomes something that he does. No, you're right. There's no limit to the extent of what he's capable of doing.
And how, as a writer, how do you cope with the emotional challenge of studying that material?
It's interesting. So I think that there are two things. For me, at the time that I started doing the work in 81, I thought Mengele was still alive. So it wasn't until 85 that I knew his bones had been found. So the book is published in 86. So for the bulk of the research on that book, I mistakenly thought that I was chasing a living fugitive. And that was the focus, if that makes sense. every bit of his crimes, all the testimony that I got from the survivors, all of the material I looked at from World War II was horrific. But what it did, instead of depressing me or making me, into this dark chamber of violence and horror, it redoubled my effort to try to locate him. So when I was in Argentina getting documents, when I was in Paraguay on the ground talking to the person, the Argentine colonel, the Paraguayan colonel who had co-sponsored his citizenship, when I was talking to Nazis in Argentina or in Paraguay, I was hoping for information that might unlock something that would lead to where he is and allow people to put him into a courtroom. Mm-hmm. It would have been different if I had been doing the work just in terms of history, knowing he was dead. So when my wife, for instance, Tricia, did her book, The Pharmacist of Auschwitz, that person had already been dead, that war criminal. That was a much more difficult project, going through the pictures, going through the testimony. It takes a toll on you in the sense that you leave your research doing it, and it doesn't leave you. You walk out at the end of the day having spent 6 or 7 hours enmeshed in this world of death and horror, and you want to go to the supermarket, or you want to take a walk and a stroll through the park, and you do that. You are buying groceries and you are taking a stroll through the park, but somehow you're thinking of this horror that was taking place behind you. So I think it is difficult. You cannot be human. You can't have a sensitive soul or heart and not have it affect you.
Yeah, too right. How did Mengele avoid authorities after the war?
So initially, he just changed his name and went to work as a farmhand in Rosenheim, a little town not far away from where his real town was in Günzburg, told his wife only and his family that here I am, I'm over here. They would come occasionally and visit him, and he stayed low key. What we didn't know, what I found out through my request for documents from the American government that were released to me, is that the Americans actually caught him twice after the end of the war. They put him into these large detention camps. There were hundreds of thousands of prisoners, being detained temporarily, displaced people from the camps. So it was a mess. The first time, they didn't know he was the SS, because when you joined the SS, you had to go back through generations to prove you had pure blood. And then you got a blood type tattoo underneath your armpit. That was the SS did that, so they knew that if you were wounded on a battlefield somewhere, they stripped the top of your uniform off. They would see that tattoo and know, A, you were an SS officer, which was the elite. So supposedly you'd be treated faster and better than anyone else. And they knew your blood type right away, so they could try to treat you. Mengele refused to have the tattoo put on because he was vain. We talked about that before. At Auschwitz, he was vain. He didn't want to mark his skin. Now, that was viewed as a mark against him in the SS files. But after the war, that worked to his benefit, because it meant when he was caught, one of the first things the Americans and the British would do is would make the soldiers take off their shirts to see if they had the SS tattoo. If they did, they'd be put in the SS portion of the camp and put under more scrutiny. Mengele didn't have the tattoo, so he was put in the normal part of the camp and wasn't subjected to the extra scrutiny. So the Americans released him twice. He sits there on this little farm, and then in 1948, the British start to do the doctors' trials. And they start to put doctors on trial, many of whom he knew, including Hitler's personal physician, Brandt, and others. And Mengele gets nervous and thinks, this victory, this justice after the war isn't going to stop. I better get further away than Germany. And his family buys him into a group of smugglers that get him to South America, and he starts his new life in South America in 1949.
Did a lot of people escape to Argentina? A lot of Nazis escaped there.
Argentina was technically neutral during World War II, and it's preposterous to think they were neutral. They were the largest German listening post outside of Europe. German intelligence agents had infiltrated. They had a German community there before the war, little areas of Bavaria that looked more German than Germany. And they had a dictator in Juan Perón, who was unabashedly pro-Hitler. So they were the area that Nazis looked to send their money to be able to escape after the war. Adolf Eichmann, who was the sort of the bureaucrat who runs the trains to get everybody to the death camps, goes there after the war. So does the camp leader of Treblinka, another big death camp, goes there. Stangl after the war, and then moves over to Brazil. Mengele goes there. And I will tell you, John, the first 10 years of Mengele's life in Argentina, it's like the good life. He goes from being a fugitive who arrives under a false name to becoming a celebrated part of the community. He has enough money from his family. He starts businesses. He goes on a skiing vacation in Switzerland. He's so confident that he will never face justice that in 1954 and 55, it's amazing. He walks into a West German embassy in Buenos Aires and says, by the way, my name isn't Helmut Greger. That's the false name he traveled under to Argentina. My name is actually Josef Mengele. That's my real German name. I'd like a passport to go to Switzerland in my real name, Josef Mengele. And the West German embassy says, sure. They process the application without asking him, why are you here under a false name? And without looking to see if that name was on the wanted list. And it's not, and the reason he's able to live so openly and even be in the phone book at one point, and this will surprise, I think, so many listeners, is even though he was on wanted list, even though there was testimony about the crimes that he had committed, he wasn't technically indicted for those crimes until 1959 by the West German government. It took 15 years for them to issue an indictment. And if it hadn't been for the efforts of a single camp survivor, Herman Langbein, who'd worked in the chief doctor's office, and the first post-war Jewish judge who sort of had them as their mission, and Tricia writes about them in her book, Mengele would never have even been indicted in 59. So it doesn't happen for 15 years. And then when he's finally indicted, he leaves Argentina and goes to the wilds of Paraguay, where he stays for a year and takes out citizenship in, guess what name? Jose Mengele. That's the official name. Now, hard to believe. They're looking for him as a wanted war criminal, and he thinks he's throwing them off the track by just changing Joseph to Jose. We laugh at it, but it worked. And then a year later, after Eichmann's kidnapped, he goes into Brazil.
Was the whole of South America friendly to Nazi Germany then?
Not all. Argentina was the most friendly in terms of that, and there were parts of the German community where if you appeared, there in America under the Clinton administration yars ago in the 90s, there had been a discussion about gay rights in the military. And Clinton came up with what we call a policy that appeased no one, and it was called "Don't ask, don't tell." Don't ask someone their sexual orientation; they don't have to tell you, and therefore it won't be a problem. That was the German attitude, and the Argentine attitude, and the South American attitude after World War II. Don't ask, don't tell. It was the equivalent of that. You never met a German who was of the age, who fought in the war, who was living in South America, and they were a relatively new immigrant to South America. You never said, what did you do during the war? It was just a taboo question. Americans and British, on the other hand, often asked people who were of wartime age, what did you do in the war? Did you serve in the Pacific? Were you in the West? Were you in Normandy? Did you liberate a concentration camp? People were interested in those issues. In Germany, that never was asked. And in South America, never asked at all.
Well, evidently got away with it then. When did the Nazi hunters seriously begin to go after Josef Mengele?
So the Nazi hunters really had been looking for him from the 1950s on. There's an Austrian Nazi hunter called Simon Wiesenthal who set up an operation privately to try to look at them and see it. But, private organizations are difficult to do. The ones who had the ability to really find him would have been Israel. So Israel had decided at that time that they would take part of their foreign intelligence agency, the Mossad, and look for these big post-war Nazis. And the two very high on the list were to find Adolf Eichmann, who was the architect that ran the bureaucracy to send the trains to Auschwitz, because he really becomes, in many ways, he doesn't have blood on his hands the way Mengele has. He has blood on his hands by being a bureaucrat. He allows the system to function by being efficient in sending people to their deaths. So they're looking for Eichmann. and they're looking for Mengele. Now, the fascinating part of it is I spoke to Mossad agents and write about this, as you know, in the book, that how they had Operation Eichmann, how they find him, how they kidnap him from a street in Buenos Aires, where he's working, by the way. He's not living the high life like Mengele. He's working at a Volkswagen plant, as a foreman for a while. He had been a Mercedes plant earlier. He has his family down there. He has his children. They kidnap him back to Israel, and they put him on trial. And they changed the law in Israel. The Supreme Court allowed it. Israel had a law that no death penalty, couldn't execute anyone. They changed it for Eichmann. After he was tried and he was convicted, they did execute Eichmann. It's the only time they had done that. But that kidnapping and the trial of Eichmann sent Mengele into a total funk and total fear. He now was afraid that everybody behind him was an Israeli agent. He was paranoid for the first time. He left, and the Israelis were looking for him. And I tell the story on Operation Mengele, how they tracked him down to what I believe was the ranch of a neo-Nazi, this Nazi who helped him after the war in southern Brazil. And at that moment, when they were ready to try to pull off an operation on him, two things happened. The first time, they get pulled back for a Middle East problem of Nazi rocket scientists working on rockets from Egypt that could hit Israel. So the Mossad launched an assassination program against those Nazi rocket scientists. Mm-hmm. When that was over, they were pushed into looking for a young Jewish boy who had been kidnapped by his Orthodox grandparents from his family. It was a national scandal in Israel. And by the time that finished, the head of the Mossad, the head of the spy agency, was new, and he said, we had the Eichmann trial. We no longer had the luxury of looking for Nazi war criminals. We were now fighting for the survival of the state. And they stopped looking for Nazis. The shame of that, John, is the Israelis had the information about where he was staying in Brazil. And what did they do? Well, I'm not surprised at this. They do what every damn intelligence agency does, whether it's MI6, the CIA, the KGB. They make a breakthrough, and then they don't share it with anybody else because they view it as their breakthrough. It's their information. It's their intelligence. They don't turn it over to the Nazi hunters in Argentina or to the Germans or to whatever else. And Mengele gets away because the last serious threat to him were the Israelis. And once they get off the job, they're looking for him. Private hunters are looking for him, but they don't come close. And John, one thing, I'm sorry to do this, to throw into you. No, before I mentioned Franz Stangl, who was the commandant of Treblinka, who later is brought back to Germany and put on trial. So we talk about Nazi hunters and how tough it is to find Nazis. Mengele was living under a false name when he goes to Brazil, agreed. And Eichmann was living under a different name, Clement. But in the case of Stangl is not found until 1970. All right, so at this point, you're talking 25 years after the end of the war. Mm. But the amazing thing to me when he was found is how he wasn't found before. He was in the telephone book in Sao Paulo. So you had to know what city to look in. I know, it's not easy, but some of them were hiding in plain sight. That's really amazing.
And it does shock me at the lack of interest, really, of governments.
Yes, I think
that sickens me more than Mengele, really.
And I think so. When you say that, the way this case and one of the most frustrating parts of it could have easily been broken time and time again, and you see it when you follow Mengele's life on the run, is by the West Germans. And they were, think of this. I say the West Germans during the entire time that Mengele was alive. It was West Germany, right? It wasn't the East. And the West Germans had a large trial. Tricia writes about her in her book because her pharmacist protagonist ends up at this trial. In 1964 and 65, Germany put on what it called the Auschwitz trial. About a dozen different people involved in the trial. That was Germany's sort of cleansing moment. And afterwards, Germans said to each other, I'm going to paraphrase this, but whether it was media, politicians, public figures, business executives, well, we confronted our past. We did it. We put on there. Now, remember, there were 7,000 to 8,000 German soldiers, Nazis, doctors, nurses at Auschwitz. They ran at one camp, 8,000. We had several dozen put on trial in 1964. So most are getting away with it. But Germany said, we did it. We had the hearing. We heard about the crimes. And afterwards, they really didn't want someone like Mengele to be found, because to be found and brought back to Germany to stand trial in the 80s or the 90s for their crime, to put the spotlight on what had happened in World War II, made everyone uncomfortable. And I'm not giving that as an excuse, but it's the inertia of the government. They looked for him, they claimed, but they did it in the most lethargic and lazy manner. They never did a mail intercept. He's sending dozens of letters to his family from his hideout in South America. If they had a simple mail intercept on one of his family members, they would have found that immediately. His son traveled in 1977 to South America to see his father in his hiding place under an assumed name. No one had his son on a record travel alert system that would have indicated he was traveling and under a false passport. So there were so many ways to break this case, not with great detective work, but with simple, basic police work. There was no incentive to do that.
Crazy. Absolutely crazy.
And I will say, sometimes somebody will say to me, well, what would be the purpose of catching him? There's no justice for somebody who did his crimes. I agree with that. I don't think of it in terms of justice being served. For me, as somebody who writes about it, as a historian, as an investigative journalist, the most important thing is the record. So you have people who are Holocaust deniers who say, oh, it never happened, it's just all made up, etc. If you had Josef Mengele, one of the architects of the experiments at Auschwitz, this leading cutting-edge doctor, in a trial in the defendant's chair, he was not ashamed of what he had done. He was proud of it. He would have defended it, boasted about it, described it. It would have been an amazing document to the revisionist to say, you know what? Why don't you look at the testimony of somebody who was involved in it? He's not ashamed of it. Mengele's testimony, that material on the trial record, would have been important for history, if nothing else. We're deprived of that, unfortunately.
Yeah, we were. Because Mengele died in Brazil in 1979.
Right.
And how did he die?
He died peacefully, unfortunately, swimming off the ocean of a stroke. And I will tell you that when his bones were found in 85, because finally the 40th anniversary of the end of the war has come in 1985. Mm-hmm. And there are these, it's back on everybody's radar. And there's the surviving twins, a handful of 100 of them, and others are talking about Mengele still being alive. And there are memorials at Auschwitz, and the media is talking about it. And it puts pressure on the German government. And then they do go in to one of the family close friends of Mengele, and they find behind a dresser a letter from them, and it sort of starts to unravel, and they eventually find the bones in Brazil. We got a call, my wife, and we were asleep at 3:30 or 4 o'clock in the morning. One day, a German reporter calls up, and Tricia answered the phone in the old days when you still had a landline. Mm-hmm. And she answers the landline, and the reporter says, is Mr. Posner there? We'd like to find out. They found bones in South America that evidently belonged to Josef Mengele. So she put her hand over the edge of the phone and said, some German reporter, they think they found Mengele's bones. And I said in this half sleep, oh, forget about it. They're always pretending they found Mengele's bones to throw off Nazi hunters. It's got to be a fake story. Well, it turned out it wasn't. I went down to Brazil a day later. I met with the dozen different forensic pathologists who came down from the United States, Germany, Israel. You can't get a dozen forensic pathologists sometimes to agree on what happened in a simple crime, much less on a case like this. Mengele's medical history, which was set out in his SS records, matched against the bones. Eventually, they found dental records. He was being treated by a Japanese dentist in Brazil. So it turned out it was his bones. But it took a while for me to believe it, because initially I thought the pressure was building to find him, and they had just gotten some rotten set of bones in some unmarked grave and pretended it belonged to him. In this case, it turned out that that's really the story.
And why did it take so long to identify him? Was that just because the family hid the fact that he died?
Yeah, they would never have told. And that's the part, I later went on an American live television talk program with his son, Rolf Mengele, who was an attorney who agreed to go on that program. There's 17-minute clip of it somewhere on YouTube,
Mm-hmm.
and I asked him in that repeatedly, why didn't you feel obligated to disclose his death at least when he died, so that people stopped looking for a ghost? And the answer to that, he doesn't really say it in so many words, but it's clear. The obligation of the family and those who protected him, protected the Nazi fugitive Mengele while he was alive. After he was dead, their obligation was not to the victims, but to the people who had helped him stay free. So they didn't want to disclose he was dead because they knew that those people in Brazil and others would be investigated. By the way, none of them, not a single one, was ever charged for a crime for harboring a fugitive by the Brazilian authorities. None of them spent a day in jail. And I think they didn't want to have the Germans investigating the Mengele family for having kept him free for all those years. And again, John, not a single member of the Mengele family ever charged by Germany for harboring, aiding, abetting, keeping a fugitive. None of it.
And what does that say about justice in the Holocaust?
That there is sometimes very little of it, and that's part of the frustrating story of it.
It is. It is. Finally, Gerald Posner, what's next for you?
Possibly, although Trish and I are having trouble finding a publisher, we want to do a book that has a Nazi-related theme to it, trying to follow a now dead, he died in the 90s, killed himself, Swiss financier, neo-Nazi, a fellow called Francois Genoux, who was sort of the banker for millions of dollars in Nazi loot after the war. And we have new historical files about how he used it to keep Nazis free in the Middle East and in South America, and how it was reinvested in German companies after the war and in groups that were fighting Israel and resistance movements. It's a great tale of what I call the remnants of the Fourth Reich after the war in terms of following the money. But we have yet to find a publisher that is interested in it. We'll continue to look.
It sounds really interesting. Yeah. Really interesting. As was this book that we've been talking about today, Mengele, the complete story there. I'm going to put a link down below so people can grab a copy. It is very, very interesting read. But frightening, like I say. So, Gerald, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a fascinating conversation.
No, thanks so much, John. I really appreciate the chance to talk with you about it, because I think that so many people think they might know the story because they've heard about him, and then when they actually read it, you're right, they don't know. The feeling people have is, my blood is boiling at how this fugitive was allowed to stay free for so many years, and how many times he could have been caught.
Well, thank you so much for joining me, like I say, and I'll put a link down below so people can grab a copy of that fascinating book.
Thanks, and I'll let you know if I ever get the other book published.
Yeah, oh, definitely, and I think I might want to talk to Tricia about her book as well.
Hers is. I just leave you with this. To me, this fascinating story of the descent of an ordinary man. So, whereas Mengele is the Nazi ideologue who goes to school and learns Nazi ideology and becomes enmeshed in it, and is part of his DNA in essence. Her story is about somebody who's drafted into the Waffen-SS in the middle of the war when Germany takes over Romania, and he's a pharmacist, and he gets assigned to one camp, and then they send him to Auschwitz, where the chief pharmacist has gone ahead and been executed for defeatism, a word the Nazis used if you thought the war was going badly. And they say to the Tricia's person called Capesius, you're a pharmacist, right? You're now the chief pharmacist. And we learned about him, by the way, John, you'll find this fascinating, from Rolf Mengele, Mengele's son. We met Rolf Mengele in 1985 in New York when he came there. I'm not Jewish. I was raised Catholic. Tricia's born in Britain and is Jewish. She had this odd feeling about meeting with Rolf. And I said, she understood intellectually that the children are not responsible for the crimes of the father. She
Yeah.
still felt odd meeting with Mengele's son. She did. And in the course of talking to us, he said, my father, after the war, he's telling us how he got away. He went to an apartment of two pharmacists in Munich who he knew, and they gave him safe haven for a while. And they knew about his crimes because they were friends with the pharmacist at Auschwitz. Now, when we left that talk that night, I'll never forget this. We walked down the street, and Tricia said to me, this is pre-Google, 1985. You can't just check it on your phone. She said, Auschwitz had a pharmacy? Like, this place that was death, what did they have a pharmacy for? And it was odd because you don't think of that.
Yeah,
Well, of
yeah.
course, there's 7,000 to 8,000 German soldiers and workers there. They get sick. They need medicine. They sometimes get the typhus that's sweeping through the camp, and they have to be treated. They have penicillin. And then you learn something interesting. The pharmacist at the camp is responsible for keeping the Zyklon B, the gas that's used as poison. So you have to go to the pharmacist to get it dispensed. That's where they're taking it from. And his roommates in the house at the pharmacy are the dentists for the camp. They're the ones pulling the gold out of the corpses. So it becomes a story of descent of an ordinary man into real evil. And then after the war, what does he do? He goes and opens a pharmacy in West Germany. No one cares until he's finally brought to justice. It's a good story.
I'll be in touch with Tricia.
Okay, fair. Okay. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and take care.
Thanks. You too. Best. Bye-bye.